Hey, what's up, everybody? It's the Grayzone. I'm Max Blumenthal here with award-winning Canadian journalist and hopefully future published author Aaron Mate. How's it going, Aaron?
It's going good. I'm working to bring that author aspiration to fruition. It's getting ever closer. And
Good.
yeah, I just had an encouraging meeting about it. Anyway, hopefully I'll have something to announce on that very soon. Wish me luck, everybody.
Good.
As I
Well,
finish my book, we're talking about a book I'm writing about the Ukraine proxy war. It's very, very close to being done. So yeah.
good. I mean, there really aren't any books other than Luke Harding's book that are out there about it.
You know,
What
my dad is traveling right now. He sent me a picture of that today and he said, I'm gonna buy this book for you.
I mean, it would be good to rebut it. I think your book is going to be one of the few critical entries out there. I hear Michael Tracy actually might be doing a book on the same issue.
Really? Okay. Huh.
And Anya Parampil just announced that her book,
Yes.
Corporate Coup on Venezuela and the new financial and political world order, is available for pre-order on the same publisher, OR Books. So be sure to pick that up and, just go to the grayzone.com. It's at the top of our website. So we'll talk about the Ukraine proxy war because it's taken a turn. We'll talk about the Russell Brand affair as well, which relates, I think, to Ukraine in a way. It also relates to the way that our thoughts are being controlled. We'll talk about that new legislation, censorship legislation across Europe, and who's behind it. And I think it's significant what just took place in Canada coming out of the G20. And it doesn't just involve Canada, it's about the diplomatic row between Canada and India over the killing of a separatist activist, if you want to call him an activist, inside Canada. Yeah, it's been one of the biggest diplomatic meltdowns between the West and India in our lifetime. And it relates to everything we're talking about, which is just that the world order is shifting and the West is doing everything it can to forestall that inevitability. So Zelensky was in Washington, Aaron. I don't know what your thoughts are on his recent trip, but it definitely seemed different than the one he took here last year, which was more triumphant and less rancorous.
The one I took here last year was a huge production. They rolled him out for a address to Congress. They held him as a second coming of Churchill. They gifted him with a huge weapons package. And this time it was a lot more low key. He addressed lawmakers behind closed doors. There was no public speech. He went to the White House with Biden, but Biden didn't say very much because Biden doesn't, perform very well now in public. So they kept that to a minimum.
Right.
And they waited till after he left to announce that they're going to give Ukraine these ATACMS missiles that Ukraine's been asking for a very long time. But even the details there are still unclear. Reportedly, it's a small number of ATACMS. And the word now for the Washington Post is that the missiles on the ATACMS are going to be cluster munitions. So, which on the one hand can hit, a wide area. But in terms of their precision, I think I know enough about military stuff to say that they're not very precise.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the reason is there. I do know it's been reported before that the Pentagon didn't want to give Ukraine ATACMS because the U.S. needs ATACMS in case they have a war with China. So that was a constraining factor there. But yeah, certainly just what is obvious is that a huge contrast between last year and this year in terms of the hoopla surrounding Zelensky. And the reason is pretty obvious. Last year when Zelensky came, it was shortly after Ukraine had scored these major victories in expelling Russian troops from Kherson and from Kharkiv. And that was being billed as a huge triumph for Ukraine, that Ukraine was on the march. But what was lost in the frenzy is that to have these gains, Ukraine lost a lot of soldiers, and also Russia didn't put much effort into those fights. They only had a minimal number of troops in those regions, and so pulling back for them was not the huge loss that it was billed to be. And then we got Russia going on the attack even more. And the result now, especially after this failed counteroffensive from Ukraine, is that Ukraine is really decimated. And so I think the lack of enthusiasm for Zelensky in Washington reflects that fact. It reflects a growing awareness that Ukraine's prospects are not very bright. And now, essentially, U.S. is being asked to continue subsidizing the country's survival and to keep it going through Biden's election campaign. That's really, I think, what a lot of this is about, is they cannot admit defeat until Biden stands for election in November 2024. So I think now basically everything is oriented around that.
So just real quickly on the ATACMS missiles and why they're such a priority for Zelensky. They are fairly long range, ground to ground missiles that have a 300-kilometer range. They typically fire a 500-pound fragmentation warhead. So it's interesting. They'll be kind of fitted with cluster munitions. But what Ukraine has had up until this point were like Storm Shadow missiles, which are air to ground fired by Su-24 MiGs, of which Ukraine does not have many. Their airfields are sitting ducks for Russian attacks. And so the ATACMS would be much easier for them to fire. And they want to have these kind of long range attacks inside Russian territory in Belgorod, in Crimea. Sevastopol was attacked today. Just go to the Twitter account of Johnny Miller, who's a English reporter who's there now. And they want to keep hammering these areas because there's not much else they can do after the counteroffensive failed. And what's going to happen next is there's going to be a lot of precipitation in the flat eastern Donbass region, which will mean it's very difficult for armor to advance. So the counteroffensive will basically be frozen. There's all this talk, oh, they're pausing it and they'll start again in the spring. But how much time do they have then when the election's going to take place and power might shift in Washington? So Ukraine just needs something to do to keep pressure on Russia and this delusion, under this delusion that they can sort of force them to the table on their own terms. And I mean, I don't see what this small number of ATACMS, after announcing they weren't going to give them, is going to do. It doesn't seem like it's going to shift the situation on the battlefield very much. And the situation on the battlefield right now greatly favors Russia.
And the question is, and you don't see this discussed very much in U.S. media, is what's Russia going to do? Because Russia so far has sat back and let the Ukrainian offensive come to them, but is Russia going to reverse that and bring their own offensive to Ukraine? And if that happens, and that's just a staggering amount of casualties ahead that we're looking at on top of the staggering amount so far. So because Russia, of course, has laid claim to 4 Ukrainian provinces, doesn't control all of them. So is Russia going to try to take them at a certain point? And if the war goes on, that's what we're looking at, is just like a massive bloodbath. And Ukraine suffering far more even than it is now, because that would be Russia going on the attack. And they've mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops for that. And in Ukraine, they're having problems mobilizing people. It was recently reported in the province of Poltava, where one local official said that for every 100 Ukrainian soldiers that were mobilized last fall, the height of the Ukrainian military response to Russia, now just 10 to 20 remain on the battlefield. The rest have either died or they've deserted or they've been wounded. So for every 100 soldiers mobilized last fall, just 10 to 20 remain. And then when they tried to recruit more people, they met just 13% of their mobilization goal. So that's just that's in one case of this region of Poltava. Maybe it's better elsewhere, but
well, here's a good point by Kid Ulysses, I guess, reference to Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant's strategy during the late stage of the Civil War was simply to destroy the Confederate army. It wasn't to simply win battles. And that was what succeeded because the Union was superior, had a superior industrial capacity. We see that Russia is outproducing even the United States with ammunition, specifically artillery ammunition like howitzers. And they have more men. They have 300,000 to 500,000 call-up depth like reserve depth to call on if they want to. Ukraine doesn't have that. That's what the Battle of Bakhmut was about from the Russian point of view, including the Wagner point of view, was just wasting the Ukrainian army. Now it appears to have been wasted, as you're pointing out, Aaron. Watch my interview with Ruslan Kotsaba, the head of the Ukrainian Pacifist League, about all of the Ukrainian men he's in contact with that are seeking to escape the conscription and escape the country because they don't want to be sent to die and they have very little training. So Zelensky appeared to have come to Washington really to ask them to rebuild his army, to ask NATO to rebuild his army. And for the first time he encountered, I mean, obviously there wasn't enough capacity there within the Senate to do anything real, but from J.D. Vance, a junior senator from Ohio, he encountered mockery and sheer contempt. He's mocking Schumer for changing the dress code, referring to John Fetterman, who we'll get to in a second. And, you know, I mean, he looks like it's like the counter-revolutionary Che Guevara, except that he's never picked up a gun in his life. As far as I know, Zelensky's a repeated draft dodger. So that's something that we didn't see last year. And then you had Rand Paul really just shred Zelensky, and not just Zelensky, but the entire kind of post-Maidan regime as undemocratic and question the logic of funding it.
Incredible story about an American journalist, Gonzalo Lira. He's reportedly right now in prison in Ukraine on allegations of spreading Russian propaganda. I don't understand this, that Joe Biden could approve $113 billion of...
That's kind of wild to see Maria Bartiromo ask about Gonzalo Lira on a primetime Fox show.
Money to Ukraine, and yet he has not tried to get this American journalist out of prison there. How is that possible?
It's even worse than that, Maria. They've canceled the elections. What kind of democracy has no election? So next year, Zelensky said he's not going to have an election because it would be inconvenient during the war and would be expensive. Well, the thing is, if you don't have elections, why in the world would we be supporting a country that's not a democracy? They've banned the political parties. They've invaded churches. They've arrested priests. So, no, it isn't a democracy. It's a corrupt regime. And are the Russians any better? No, the Russians are worse. But at the same time, we don't always have to pick some side to be on. But the ultimate reason I'm against this is we don't have the money. And when we borrow more money, it leads to more inflation, leads to more likelihood of recession in our country. And so we just can't keep doing it.
So I mean, much more outspoken opposition from the Republican side than we heard last year. Things are starting to get old.
Yeah, well, luckily, Ukrainian proxy warriors can count on Democrats, including progressive Democrats, to offer a counter narrative. So here, for example, is Senator John Fetterman, noted working class champion, who says, after meeting with Zelensky, meeting with President Zelensky only affirms my 1,000% support for Ukraine. If you can't support Ukraine right now, that's un-American, and you're not standing up for democracy.
Yeah. And Fetterman, he went on to, I think he said this before, and this is all in reference to the dress code relaxation that has been done for him. If those jagoffs in the House stop trying to shut a real working class term there, stop trying to shut our government down. I don't know if he's referring directly to Jimmy Dore, but he's not in the House. Jagoff nightclub comedian Jimmy Dore. If they stop trying to shut our government down and fully support Ukraine, whatever that means, then I will save democracy by wearing a suit on the Senate floor next week. Now, just to be clear about this, John Fetterman said that he could not wear a suit because he felt more comfortable dressing kind of like an adult toddler with some big gym shorts on and some socks and maybe a hoodie or a big t-shirt and sneakers going to the Senate because he was clinically depressed and he had to take leave from the Senate because of his depression. And so Chuck Schumer relaxed the rules. Now he says that he could wear a suit and he would wear a suit if the Senate would just fully support Ukraine. And so I said, well, it sounds like he's more comfortable in World War III than in a hoodie. But what does it mean to fully support Ukraine here?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I assume he means the Lindsey Graham line, because Lindsey Graham also has said that the U.S. is not sufficiently supporting Ukraine. So that means sending them all the weapons that he wants, which means that John Fetterman is endorsing the Lindsey Graham stance of fighting Russia to the last person. That's what Lindsey Graham said, that as long as we support Ukraine, they will fight to the last person. So that now has become the progressive stance in Congress. And John Fetterman is not the exception. He's the rule when it comes to the progressive support for the Ukraine war effort. And even now using terms such as un-American. So basically Ronald Reagan and his acolytes, they've taken over the Democratic Party. I mean, that's what you were told if you criticized the U.S. line on Russia. You're un-American, you're un-American. And now a progressive Democrat is saying that. And it's pretty extraordinary. And yeah, I guess for John Fetterman, the cure for his depression is World War III.
And then there's a certain commonality between John Fetterman and other key supporters of the Ukraine proxy war. He's kind of like a cyborg. He had a stroke and he was unable to function without the help of computers and machines. He simply was unable to participate in the debates, and he was completely incoherent in the Senate debates against Mehmet Oz, his Republican challenger. And he needs constant assistance in order to participate in the work of being a senator. Basically, he's being told what to say. So I don't even know what he thinks about Ukraine. Then you have Mitch McConnell, who nearly had a stroke during a press conference. He froze for like a full minute. It was like his brain froze. And then you have Joe Biden, who is clearly not he's not mentally competent, and he needs to be delivered prepared scripts. He often goes off script and says bizarre things, and it just doesn't feel like they're in charge. So the Ukraine thing is just kind of like this zombie that's stalking through the halls of power in Washington. And until someone who can act, until the voters get to have a say, it's just going to be there. Actually, Rand Corp, which is a think tank closely connected to the Pentagon, recently published this paper, which I think is very relevant to the state of Washington today. Could dementia in the national security workplace create a security threat? All these guys seem to be sleepwalking into World War III, and the public is turned on it. So good question by Rand Corporation.
Well, speaking of which, here's Mitch McConnell, and listen to how I'll listen to his latest justification for the proxy war.
On another issue, looking forward to seeing President Zelensky on Thursday. I think it's always good to remind everyone that a good portion of the money allocated to Ukraine is being spent in this country to rebuild our industrial base.
Isn't that amazing? And isn't he lucky that he has the support of Bernie Sanders, the entire squad, the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus, who always talk about, wanting to use government resources to help people, give people jobs, rebuild infrastructure, but yet don't obviously put all their weight behind it, but then bend over backwards to help Mitch McConnell rebuild the military industrial base and brag about it. So it's like, this is the way the Democrats can actually be involved in social spending and rebuilding our base, by giving it to the military industrial complex and joining with Mitch McConnell. And maybe they can figure out a way to help rebuild the U.S. Industrial base without doing it for the military industrial complex. But they haven't figured that out. They haven't figured that out yet, obviously.
I mean, it's one of the only things we produce in this fake financialized economy, and is one of the reasons why the U.S. has miscalculated in Joe Biden's attempt to reduce the ruble to ruble, is that Russia actually has a productive economy based on real exports. What do we export? Well, weapons is one of the main U.S. exports. So it's natural that McConnell would say that. But the question is, if this is really a war that where the U.S. is simply supporting Ukraine in its self-defense, why do American leaders and key lawmakers keep emphasizing the economic benefits of this war to the U.S. And it's there where they really give away the game.
Yeah. And we're approaching the 1-year anniversary of those brief 24 hours when congressional progressives put out that letter asking Joe Biden very nicely for diplomacy. It only lasted 24 hours because after some neocons freaked out at them on social media and elsewhere, they withdrew the letter, which is literally one of the most embarrassing congressional episodes I've ever seen. Pramila Jayapal withdrawing her own letter calling for diplomacy. So we're approaching the 1 year of that. And ever since that happened, none of them have made a peep about trying to stop the war. It's all just been uniform support. And even when General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even when he came out a few weeks later in favor of diplomacy, none of them said a word. Truly one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen, but exactly the behavior you could expect from this curious crop of progressives who we now have in Congress and who call themselves progressives for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, maybe if a Republican in the White House gives them the opportunity to turn against this war, will they do it? Will they do it? I don't know. I don't think so.
I doubt it.
But the reception in the UN was no less underwhelming for Zelensky. The Ukrainian media basically is under the complete control of the Ukrainian state at this point. It's a nonstop propaganda mill. It's under Zelensky's orders to broadcast 24/7 wartime propaganda. All opposition media is pretty much banned. And so here's how one Ukrainian TV outlet broadcast Zelensky's UN speech. His UN speech was not heavily attended. Many countries either just didn't attend or boycotted it. The United States attempted to fill the auditorium. And so basically what happened was this channel cut in clips of crowd.
Не розгортати цю зброю, не розповсюджувати, не допускати погрози нею, не допускати тренування
from other speeches
для того, щоб забезпечити ядерне
to
роззброєння.
make Zelensky look
І це
important,
хороша
to make
стратегія.
it look like he was the center
Pause it there.
here. But
повинна
wait a minute.
Yeah.
Who's that? Who's that guy? So Zelensky's watching Zelensky. Like the Truman Show or Being There or something. I can't think of the right metaphor, but he's basically, I mean, it's the most meta thing ever. Zelensky is watching Zelensky and the whole hall is packed. But I think what they cut in was Biden's speech.
Yeah, it must have been Biden's speech.
Yeah.
Не повинна бути єдиною стратегією для того, щоб
He's the center of
убезпечити
action.
світ від війни, від останньої війни.
But there he is watching his speech. But, you know, if you actually watch the speech on like the UN's broadcasting system or C-SPAN or whatever, Zelensky wasn't in the crowd. He was on stage and the room was not full. It wasn't even half full. And then you have, I mean,
he's even losing now the support of Poland.
Yeah,
which
I was
is
going to bring up Poland.
announced that it stopped sending weapons to Ukraine. And there's a big dispute there over Ukrainian grain, where Poland says that that's hurting Polish farmers, to the point where the Polish government says it's not going to be sending weapons to Ukraine. And the Polish president said something extraordinary. He said that Ukraine is like, he compared Ukraine to a drowning person who pulls you down with them as they're drowning, which, coming from a Polish leader, I mean, that's pretty striking.
Here's the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, from the Law and Justice Party.
Mamy trochę do czynienia tak z tonącym. My jesteśmy tym, który ratuje. Jak jest tonący, każdy, kto kiedykolwiek brał udział w ratowaniu tonącego, czy każdy, kto
That he
kiedykolwiek
is extremely
uczył
dangerous
się o
because
tym,
he can
co
pull
dzieje
you to
się
the
w trakcie
depths.
tej sytuacji, wie o tym, że człowiek tonący jest niesłychanie niebezpieczny, ponieważ może pociągnąć w głębiny. Ma siłę
He has unimaginable strength due to the
niewyobrażalną na
fear and
skutek
influence of
obawy
adrenaline and can simply
osobistej,
drown the rescuer.
wpływu adrenaliny i może po prostu utopić ratującego. Chwyta się
They say a
wszystkiego,
drowning
mówi się
person is
przecież w
grasping
przysłowiu
at
tonący
straws.
brzytwy się chwyta. Rzeczywiście tonący chwyta się wszystkiego, czego się da. Trochę to jest taka
Indeed, a
sytuacja,
drowning
jak
person
dzisiaj
is
między Polską
grasping
a
at anything
Ukrainą.
he
Czy
can.
trzeba działać tak, żeby się obronić
Is it necessary to act in such a way to protect oneself from being
uczynieniem nam
harmed by a
szkody przez
drowning person,
tonącego?
referring to
Oczywiście, że
Ukraine?
musimy
Of
tak
course,
działać, żeby się
we must
obronić
act
przed
mainly in
uczynieniem
such
nam
a way as
szkody
to
przez
not harm
tonącego,
ourselves.
bo jak
Because if
tonący
a drowning person
doprowadzi
causes
do
harm and
szkody i
drowns
nas
us,
utopi, to
we
nie
will not get
dostanie
help.
pomocy. W związku z powyższym
We have to look after
to
our
my musimy
interests,
pilnować tutaj
do it
swoich interesów. To
effectively
jest przede wszystkim
and
nasz obowiązek
decisively.
i będziemy to robili.
So that was Andrzej Duda, the Polish president. Poland is the bastion, the bulwark of NATO, the country through which all of the arms have been shipped into Ukraine. It's basically on the other side of the border from a NATO training base inside Ukraine at Yaroviv. And now it's announcing no more arms to Ukraine. And what's happening here is, as the result of the grain deal, the Black Sea grain deal, Ukraine has been dumping its grain on Eastern Europe, on Europe in general. So first of all, it's not reaching the African nations that need it most, but it's harming Polish farmers. And Duda and the Law and Justice Party have an election coming up. They're facing Donald Tusk's party. And they're also facing a far right party called the Confederation, which is gaining support. It's kind of like a libertarian party, and it's opposing aiding Ukraine. And the farmers are outraged. And so they're having to respond to domestic political pressure by pulling away from Ukraine. This is according to the AP. Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Croatia banned some Ukrainian agricultural goods after the EU recently decided to lift such restrictions. Croatia joined in Tuesday when Kiev announced it was responding with a World Trade Organization complaint. And now Kiev's threatening to sue all of them. So the whole thing's cracking apart. I mean, this is really the front line of NATO, but they have their own domestic political considerations. And the Law and Justice Party, by the way, is dropping significantly in the polls because of Ukraine. It's a major issue.
And even some of the propaganda is falling apart. So this week there was a pretty extraordinary admission in the New York Times about what was said to be earlier this month a Russian missile strike on a market in Donetsk that killed 17 people. It was one of the worst attacks of the war this year. And initially, the Ukrainian government claimed that it was committed by Russia. And so naturally, Western media stenographers played along with that. So here, for example, is Democracy Now! Russian missile strike kills 17 and wounds dozens in Ukraine's Donetsk. And the same day, Democracy Now! Featured that claim in a segment where they interviewed a Ukrainian and a Russian supporter of the proxy war who compared Putin to Hitler and so on, talked about wanting to send more weapons to Ukraine. So incidents like this were used to help manufacture support for the proxy war. But then we got this from the New York Times just this week. Evidence suggests Ukrainian missile caused market tragedy. Now, of course, the Times was not the first outlet to, or the first voice to note this. Immediately on social media after this market attack, people were, including some pro-Ukrainian voices, were pointing out that actually it looked like the direction of this missile was coming from Ukrainian-controlled territory. But because the Ukrainian government had decreed that Russia did it, that's what Western media outlets went along with. But the New York Times coming out and saying this, being the heart of the establishment, was a pretty huge blow to the narrative. And this story happened to coincide with Zelensky's arrival in the U.S. for the UN General Assembly. And maybe that was coincidental, but certainly it was embarrassing for his government that this was admitted.
Yeah, it was Julian Rupke of Bild, the Springer publication in Germany, who we used to call him Jihadi Julian because he was such a cheerleader of the Syrian armed opposition backed by the CIA during the Syria proxy war. And he's hugely pro-NATO. And he noted that the missile had to have come from the northwest, which was Ukrainian military controlled territory. There was no way it could have been fired by Russia. And then, of course, all the NAFO trolls came in on him, his own audience, and started assaulting him digitally. And I pointed that out on Twitter. And the next thing you know, the New York Times confirms that, hey, he had a point. And of course, the Russians were saying this all along, but who's going to listen to them? And who's going to listen to the conspiracy theorists on the Mariupol Dramatic Theater, which is still such a bizarre incident where there's still no video of any missile strike, no video of any rescue, no record of any bodies being carried out. Then you have the Kramatorsk train station incident where the serial number on the Tashka-U missile, which is in the Ukrainian arsenal, was a Ukrainian serial number, which matched those of other Ukrainian attacks. You have in Dnipro on the apartment building attack, which was similarly reported to be a Russian attack. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former advisor, came out and said this was actually one of our own anti-aircraft missiles, which landed on the apartment block. And he was punished for saying that. So you have all these incidents, and not to say Russia isn't hitting civilian infrastructure or Russia hasn't done horrible things in the war. It's just that the way that it's been reported with so many of the major incidents has been completely false. And so finally, the New York Times does it. I think you're right, Aaron. It's significant for them to do that right before Zelensky arrives in Washington and signals the party might be over at some point soon.
And another example of propaganda being undermined from within comes from Jens Stoltenberg, who made a point that has been said by proxy war critics like us from the start. But when we say it, we get accused of spreading Russian propaganda. But he also admitted the truth, which is that a lot of this war is based on the fact that Russia did not want NATO expansion on its borders, including in Ukraine.
The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. The back.
So again, remember, we were told that actually Putin went to war because he wanted to take over Ukraine and then move on to the rest of Europe next, right? That was the official story we got. Here's Jens Stoltenberg admitting that actually, no, Russia went to war to prevent NATO on its borders, among other reasons, but that was a big one.
Yeah. So he's basically saying that the Ukraine proxy war is a war of NATO expansion, and that Ukraine must win in order to legitimize NATO's continued expansion and to prevent Russia from being able to deter it. In other words, to prevent Russia from stopping the placement of major military installations directly on its borders, all across its frontiers, something which no powerful Western country, whether it's France, Germany, or the United States, would accept from a perceived adversary like Russia or China. He's basically saying Russia has no strategic depth. It will not be granted it. And we will eventually move to balkanize it. And there's an entire paper from 2019 published by RAND Corp called Extending Russia, which provides a blueprint for doing just that. So it's not as though Stoltenberg was referring in abstract to a plan to weaken and destroy Russia as an independent power.
And, even on the very narrow issues that the U.S. was willing to talk about, they wouldn't even talk about NATO expansion. But even after the U.S. and NATO rejected Russia's draft treaties, the ones that Stoltenberg was talking about, the U.S. and Russia did still engage in some talks in that critical January, February 2022 period, right before Russia invaded. And initially, and this comes from Ray McGovern, who's I think the only person I've seen in the West to point this out. But initially, according to the Kremlin, Biden told Putin in a phone call in late December that we have no intention of putting offensive weaponry inside of Ukraine, and we're happy to discuss that with you. So that led to some talks. But then about less than 2 months later, the Kremlin put out a statement, which nobody noticed here in the West, saying that the U.S. has not responded to us at all even on the issue of placing offensive weapons inside of Ukraine. So forget NATO expansion, which the U.S. refused to even discuss, even on the narrow issue of putting offensive weapons inside of Ukraine. After Biden, possibly in a gaffe, blurted out that he wouldn't do that, the Biden administration, according to Ray McGovern, walked that back as well. So basically, that left nothing to discuss. And coupled with the fact that Zelensky, meanwhile, was refusing to speak to the leaders of the Donbass rebellion and refusing to implement the Minsk Accords and talking about taking back those territories by force, that is all part of the background to this war, along with the NATO expansion that Jens Stoltenberg just admitted to.
So more signs of the party slowly ending. I wouldn't say ending, but the party's slowly wrapping up. Is one of the key propagandists, most visible propagandists of the Ukrainian military has been suspended. We're talking about Sarah Ashton Cirillo, formerly known as Democratic Party Las Vegas-based activist Michael Cirillo, who showed up as a journalist first in Ukraine and then became sort of a volunteer for the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces, and then was appointed as official English language spokesperson. And this person had a long record of demented statements, celebrating the torture of Russian POWs, the killing of Russian POWs, threats against their critics. And they finally just kind of lost it with this statement here.
Russia hates the truth that their obsessive focus on a Ukrainian volunteer is simply allowing the light of the Ukrainian nation's honesty to shine brightly. Next week, the teeth of the Russian devils will gnash ever harder, and their rabid mouths will foam in uncontrollable frenzy as the world will see a favorite Kremlin propagandist pay for their crimes. And this puppet of Putin is only the first. Russia's war criminal propagandists will all be hunted down, and justice will be served as we in Ukraine are led on this mission by faith in God, liberty, and complete liberation.
So Sarah was promising apparently the assassination of a journalist that was critical of Ukraine's war effort, or a Russian propagandist. We've seen already many assassinations of media figures, Vladimir Tatarsky, Daria Dugina, targeted terror attack level assassinations inside Russia. And it got a little bit too extreme because this video went viral and the public started to see that Ukraine is not only a kind of a U.S. sponsored freak show at a time when U.S. aid is being challenged as it has never been challenged before in Washington, but that it has a policy of assassinating people for the things they say. So Sarah Ashton Cirillo suspended. I don't know where they are right now. I've heard some rumors that they're in prison or that they have fled with their life from Ukraine, but I'm sure we'll find out soon. But I think, Aaron, the focus, the pinpoint focus on this extremely bizarre, demented character overlooks the fact that this is Ukrainian policy and has been Ukrainian policy to detain, torture, and kill critics of the war effort.
Well, on that front, I really recommend people listen to your interview with that Ukrainian war resistor who's now living in New York. That's up at the Grayzone, and it was
Ruslan Kotsaba is his name.
Such an enlightening interview. I really recommend that.
Yeah. I don't know how it was possible for Sarah Ashton Cirillo to go too crazy when like them just showing up is just completely bonkers, but they finally did it. And honestly, I think the order came from Washington. They're like, you guys can't, what are you doing out there? JD Vance, actually, the senator from Ohio, came in as an opponent of the Ukraine proxy war, conservative Republican, put in a request with the U.S. government, with the State Department, I think, demanding to know if Sarah Ashton Cirillo was a U.S. agent or if they had their position was funded in any way with U.S. tax dollars. And Cirillo had to do a video in their final video responding to Vance's request and did not answer the question directly. And so I think it is a valid question. Is this a kind of a U.S. agent? How did they get to Ukraine and wind up in that position? Considering they were a prominent Democratic activist under another identity in Las Vegas, engaged in some very provocative activities. I mean, look up what they did to entrap several Proud Boys in Las Vegas in a very weird operation, like a sting operation.
And there's a precedent there. What's her name? Nina Jankowicz, remember, who was going to be the so-called disinformation czar. She
Yeah.
worked for some sort of Ukrainian, for some sort of U.S. government operation inside of Ukraine.
She was on Zelensky's presidential campaign.
There we go. She was an advisor there, but also she worked for something called Stop Fake, where she would put up propaganda videos minimizing the Nazi heritage, affiliations and views of the Azov battalion. I know Lev Golinkin
Of Stop
wrote about
Fake's
that.
leadership were Azov members and were noted Nazi supporters.
There we go. And that had a U.S. government role too. That received some U.S. government funding. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But I'm also not surprised that they got rid of them, because this was just really embarrassing, and the comments were insane. Were totally insane.
Well, like Russia was pointing to it as the sort of the decadence and what's the best word for it? I mean, they're putting a trans person up as a official spokesperson in an Eastern European Slavic country where gender ideology is not exactly popular. And so Russia was pointing at it to show that Ukraine was sort of controlled from the outside by evil forces.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised.
Damaging.
I wouldn't be surprised if Jamie Raskin put in a personal request for a trans spokesperson, because he put out that statement after he backtracked on signing that letter calling for diplomacy, and he took part in this effort to throw that letter under the bus, a letter he had signed. He put out a letter that centered the fact that Russia, he said, was the center of anti-trans hatred, and that if you arm Ukraine, you're somehow supporting the rights of the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, it was almost like he was referring to Sarah Ashton Cirillo, because he said, LGBTQIAA plus members serve in the Ukrainian military. I'm like, who are you referring to? So it seemed like a really bungled marketing technique to try to win over American liberals, since Democrats held the purse strings in Washington. Maybe that was the idea there, but it's totally backfired, and it's over. I don't know what they were thinking, but and the fact is, why would you do that unless you were controlled from the outside? I mean, no other Eastern European country is going to do something like that.
I mean, they could claim it's because we believe so much in pluralism and the rights of everybody, but then it's hard to square that with the fact that you have neo-Nazi military formations in your government. You have people with openly anti-Semitic views, openly anti-LGBTQ views. I mean, like, remember that one Nazi gang leader who bragged about how if not for the fascist forces of the Maidan, then there would have been a gay pride parade. So yeah.
Well, at least get a Ukrainian to do it. Like, this person can't even speak Russian or Ukrainian. They've never been to the region before. I don't know. I think maybe they're going to replace them with Oz Chatterjee. That's my prediction.
I forgot about that guy. For those that don't know who he is, it's because he's an internet
not worth
troll.
knowing.
Internet troll who stalks people who are against proxy wars, pretty much.
Who's apparently based in Kiev right now.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
That's my prediction. And it'll be no less of a freak show. And speaking of freak shows, I mean, or speaking of pissing off Republicans, as as a PR move. Zelensky has appointed an artist named Marina Abramovich to be the ambassador for Ukraine. And this is the spirit cooking lady who is at the center of all of the Pizzagate conspiracy theories. This is the lady who conceived spirit cooking, which John Podesta was practicing, and it was exposed through the Podesta leaked emails, and is seen as satanic by the Christian right and a lot of the right. So this was like a perfect move to play into their hands.
And has she accepted? Has she accepted this position? Like, is she? Because she's not even Ukraine. She's Serbian.
Yeah, she's Serbian.
Yeah,
she's done events with Zelensky before. And she
Okay.
did this crystal wailing wall with Zelensky and I think the Israeli ambassador, and it's based on the Western Wall in the old city of Jerusalem, but with crystals on it. Just weird stuff. I'm just saying it's like they're deliberately trying to instigate Republican opposition to them.
I remember the last time I heard of Marina or whatever her name is. Sorry, I can't pronounce it.
Abramovich, yeah.
Abramovich. She did this thing in New York at MoMA, I think, where you would go, people would line up for hours, and she was sitting. She was the whole art was she was sitting in a chair in a room. People would go wait for hours and sit in front of her for a few minutes, and just they would stare at each other, and that was her performance. It went on for people would go and like start crying for some reason because it's so powerful to be in her presence, I guess, to be stared at as she sat there silently. So that's the last time there we go. Yeah.
There she is to the right. This is the new cultural ambassador to Ukraine on the right.
Yeah.
And to the left is someone stripping in front of her at MoMA.
There we go. Yeah. So I remember
I don't know if Jesse Helms were around, he'd use this to like defund the National Endowment of the Arts or something. It's like brilliant.
I remember not going to this while a bunch of other people did, and I feel very vindicated for that decision now. But anyway,
I don't know. I mean, it could have been like it's like so bad it's good.
Who knows? Yeah.
It's yeah. I don't know. At least he didn't appoint Greta Thunberg yet.
That's coming. I mean, they've already met. They've had meetings, and Greta Thunberg's met with Zelensky and parroted his line many times. So, and by the way, this was pointed out this week. I saw Nick Cruz of Revolutionary Blackout point this out in response to, I think, the Sunrise Movement. They were touting the fact that Joe Biden is creating some new youth climate corps or something. Right?
Yeah.
And Nick Cruz asked him, he says, how come you haven't said anything about Biden blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines? One of the worst emissions of methane ever, if not the worst. Very bad for the environment. And that was a good reminder that the 1-year anniversary of the Nord Stream bombings are coming up as well. And, it's just one of those things that everybody, including the environmental movement, has just accepted as not a big deal.
Yeah, I don't think they ever had any problem with it. The climate justice movement never seemed to have any problem with it. And, why should they? Why should they? It was only the largest release of methane ever.
Since we're making fun of artists, should we make fun of one more person?
Let's do it. Here's this is one of the biggest supporters of Zelensky on the planet and of this whole endless war effort. Sean Penn. I don't know if there's specific. Yeah, here we go. This is from Sean Penn's new film.
I think you see that we are just ordinary people who wants to live in our country.
I don't know if you want to introduce this, Aaron.
Well, you can fast forward it to Sean Penn's interview, which is right after this. But basically, Sean Penn is promoting a new documentary. It's called Superpower, where he embedded with Zelensky and was in Ukraine. And he's just basically on a campaign to arm Ukraine to the teeth. And he's mad at Joe Biden for not sending enough weapons to Ukraine. That's Sean Penn's cause. And let's just hear a bit of him talking about it. I got to hear.
In one of the clips, Andrei Yermak, one of the top advisors to President Zelensky, says to you, the U.S. position should be stronger if the United States and Joe Biden doesn't do something now. Essentially, he says America's over. That followed with a pretty robust financial investment by the United States, more than $50 billion, pledges of weapons. But from what I've heard you say, you think the United States isn't doing enough.
It is my absolute view that
This is the guy from Three Stooges.
caution with which the United States has pledged support, which seemed, in my reading of February 2022, was a like a lean on in the fear of nuclear conflict. Something I think all of us should look very carefully at and understand that, of course, is possible, and that's to be concerning. The likelihood is extremely low, and as one of our witnesses in the film says, are we going to let a gangster with nuclear weapons dictate the way we live? So I think that, and that the Ukrainians won't let him do that.
That's Sean Penn saying that we should not be worried about the threat of nuclear war, and we should escalate it even further. And he says, are we going to let Putin dictate the way we live? As if like Putin is trying to impose, I don't know, Christian Orthodox doctrine on American Western society. No, it's a question of how much are we going to escalate a proxy war with a nuclear armed power? It's not about how we live. And for Sean Penn, it's clearly not enough. And he's saying we shouldn't worry about nuclear weapons. And again, Putin has never threatened nuclear war beyond what Russia's doctrine already is, which is in the event of an existential threat to Russia or a nuclear strike on Russia, then Russia will use nuclear weapons. That's what Putin has reiterated. And the U.S. has made the deliberate choice to basically not do anything that could engage in a direct conflict with Russia because they don't want to fight Russia. They want to use Ukraine to fight Russia. So that's what all this is about. This is not about being overly cautious in how many weapons to send. It's about making sure the fight stays inside of Ukraine so that the West doesn't have to fight Russia, and that so Ukrainians are the ones dying. And that's why you've seen this slow drip feed of weapons over the course of the war. Because every time there's an opportunity to prolong the war longer with some more weapons, the Biden administration takes it. It's not about meeting Ukraine's particular battlefield needs. It's about strategically pouring in weapons to make the war go longer, because that's all the U.S. cares about, using Ukraine to bleed Russia. And people like Sean Penn don't understand that because they've really convinced themselves that Putin is the new Hitler, and if he is not defeated in Ukraine, he'll go on to conquer the rest of the world. It looks like he actually believes that.
Well, we've done Sean Penn before. We pointed out that Sean Penn's core organization is just a part of the fraudulent humanitarian and development industrial complex that looks for conflicts around the world as methods of raising money and paying for their staff to have lavish galas and fame. And Jose Andres is part of it. Samantha Power is directing it through the U.S. The Red Cross and the Obamas are siphoning off tons of donations for administrative costs and doing very little on the ground. They wasted Haiti aid. And Sean Penn was running around doing COVID testing throughout the pandemic, and was at the same time calling for unvaccinated people to be imprisoned. Before that, where else would he be? He was in Haiti getting USAID money to do who knows what. There's no perceptible, discernible impact of him having helped anyone. And now he's sort of involved in Ukraine, and it's obviously to fuel his own celebrity. He seems to be some sort of an agent. And remember, during the Bush era, he was against the Iraq war because that was the popular thing to do in Hollywood. He seems to believe in nothing.
He also was friendly with Hugo Chavez for a little bit, gave him some positive coverage, but then also pretty much threw Venezuela under the bus as well. And said that Maduro is basically a dictator. There's nothing like Chavez on because
when Maduro came in, it wasn't cool anymore. Chavez was like all the celebrities wanted to be around Chavez, just like they wanted to be around Fidel. But like Miguel Diaz-Canel is facing like a humanitarian catastrophe in Cuba under the U.S. blockade, which Biden refuses to release. Actually, Representative Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, who's been an opponent of the blockade, went to meet with the Biden's State Department and NSC about somehow relaxing it and came away just shocked at how obstinate they were. And humanitarian catastrophes unfolding in Cuba. You don't see any celebrities rushing down there to take pictures with Miguel Diaz-Canel because he's not the revolutionary cool guy. So they don't care. They don't care about anything except getting in the limelight. And, there's no revolutionary chic anymore in Hollywood. They're all co-opted through CAA, creative artists, by the CIA. And that's what Sean Penn is. And, he's well past his due date as an actor. So this is how he can stay in the limelight.
Anyway, that's your promo for Superpower by Sean Penn, streaming now. I think co-produced with Vice, of course.
Of course. Vice funded by George Soros.
Yeah, Viceroy News. And
hipster imperialism.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they're hipster anymore. I don't even know if they try to do that.
Yeah, they're going through some. I mean, we're kind of punching down at this point.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good transition to another celebrity issue here. I had it up. I don't know what happened to it. For some reason, I have Larry from Three Stooges up on my browser.
I think you wanted to compare his face to Sean Penn's.
Yes, that must be why. Okay, well, here's 8 minutes ago. Russell Brand dropped this. So I'm just going to put it up there and we're going to discuss the Russell Brand affair in light of new developments in the EU and UK, to new developments or new laws to censor speech, to effectively ban encrypted applications, and to control the minds of European citizens. Russell Brand is a citizen of the UK. He lives in England, and there's been a major scandal relating to him. And just before I play this, I think the reason why our last segment about Sean Penn was so significant was because Russell Brand has taken the opposite position on the Ukraine proxy war, and he is possibly the most prominent figure in the West to take that position. And he has hosted both me and Aaron on his online show. And so I think that is important, pivotal, or central context to understanding this scandal. But I haven't watched anything he's said yet. This just went up. So let's hear what he has to say in response to this scandal, which is the scandal is serious allegations of sexual impropriety, abuse, and even rape between 2006 and 2013 have surfaced in Murdoch-controlled media in the UK and been disseminated in coordinated fashion through British tabloid media against Russell Brand.
Awakening wonders. Obviously, it's been an extraordinary and distressing week, and I thank you very much for your support and for questioning the information that you've been presented with. By now, you're probably aware that the British government have asked big tech platforms to censor our online content, and that some online platforms have complied with that request. What you may not know is that this happens in the context of the Online Safety Bill, which is a piece of UK legislation that grants sweeping surveillance and censorship powers, and it's a law that has already been passed. I also don't imagine you've heard of the Trusted News Initiative. Now, as is often the case when a word like trusted is used as part of an acronym to describe an unelected body, trust is the last thing you should be offering. The Trusted News Initiative is a collaboration between big tech and legacy media organizations to target, control, choke, and shut down independent media organizations like this one. We'll be talking about that on our show on Monday on Rumble. But just to give you an idea of what the TNI is, this is a quote from one of their spokespeople. Because the actual real rivalry now is not between the BBC and CNN globally, it's actually between all trusted news providers and digital platforms. It's clear that these organizations collaborate in constructing narratives, whether that's around the war or the pandemic. And of course, there are other examples. And it's very clear to me that we have to be very, very cautious indeed. That's why I'm asking you to follow me on Rumble. Rumble have made a clear commitment to free speech, and Rumble is the primary platform that we will be streaming from. We'll be back this Monday, and as usual, we'll be talking about deep state and corporate collusion and how ordinary democracy is anathema now, how it's shut down, ignored, and avoided. We'll be talking about a military-industrial complex that is able to facilitate and start wars that seem sometimes to be little more than money laundering operations. And that's with all respect to the hundreds of thousands of victims of the numerous ongoing wars in the world at the moment. We'll be talking about the role of Big Pharma and how Big Pharma have been able to influence government policy around the world and how they've been able to evade due liability and necessary scrutiny, how they've been able to avoid media investigation that perhaps ought be due them. And of course, we'll be talking about media corruption and censorship. So please follow me on Rumble, because that's the only way that we can keep our voice.
All right. So basically, Russell Brand has been demonetized on YouTube, and we'll talk about why. And Rumble has issued a letter announcing that they will not submit to the British government's request to demonetize Russell Brand. TikTok got a request. I assume everyone got a request. And it does relate to the online safety bill, which we'll talk about in a second, because it has implications for us at the Grayzone. It has implications for everyone who lives in a ostensible liberal democracy. Why did he get demonetized? Well, it's because of these accusations, and the accusations are anonymous, but they seem serious. They took place at a time when Russell Brand was frequently on drugs, was an alcoholic, was partying a lot, was the toast of Hollywood, and was the darling of the BBC and Channel 4. And he has kind of carved out a renaissance as a rehabilitated person who is sober, who's interested in spirituality. I actually grew up with someone who appears at his consciousness festivals, who had a similar experience, who, overcame drug addiction and is now, helping other people with addiction and problems through spirituality, consciousness, meditation. And Russell Brand, as you can see, is a major critic of the Ukraine proxy war, of corporate media. And so I made this point on Twitter, showing footage that a friend of a friend actually took at a London newsstand the day the Russell Brand news broke. And this footage makes it so obvious what's going on here. Well, you can just take a look at the newsstand. Every paper was ready to go with these headlines, and they are lapping it up. They want to destroy him. Accused of rape. They want him destroyed. And they want him destroyed not because he's a rapist necessarily, although rape is bad, and I'm sure everybody agrees rape is bad, but because of what he said about them, because he is their most prominent critic. And he's the most prominent critic of Zelensky, and he has so many viewers. And he was the most prominent critic of the COVID restrictions. And so I said, if he had just made this requisite celebrity pilgrimage to Zelensky and kept his mouth shut about the COVIDians, he would have dodged this bullet. Whatever the merits of the allegations might be, and they might be merited, this much is obvious. And we should also keep in mind that people even we know, Aaron, have been falsely accused of serious allegations. Trevor Fitzgibbon, the publicist, he used to represent the Bolivarian government of Venezuela. He represented a lot of progressive causes. He was involved with Occupy and other. He was falsely accused, and his career was nearly destroyed. He pretty much had to disappear for years. Someone who attacks us all the time to get attention, and he still fails to get it, Jordan Chariton. He was falsely accused at TYT and lost his job there. So a lot of people have been falsely accused. And then there are people who have really done horrible things, and the accusations were true. So I'm not going to make a judgment on the accusations, but they still are just accusations. And what YouTube has done is unprecedented. because they've demonetized Russell Brand based on off-platform behavior. I never knew that this was part of their terms of service. He's the first person I know of, and obviously the most major, to be demonetized and basically canceled because of something not because of his video content, but because of something he did off the platform, for which we don't even know. And we don't even know for sure that he did it. It hasn't been adjudicated in a court of law. He's just accused of it. Pretty much anybody can be accused of something. Cardi B, who I think has videos on YouTube that are monetized. She must make tons of money, or her record company must make tons of money off them. She freely admitted to drugging men when she was a stripper, having sex with them, and then or luring them to sex and then robbing them blind, robbing all their belongings. Is that off-platform behavior that comports with YouTube's terms of service? Well, I don't know. The Obama Foundation has monetized videos on YouTube. Obama raped Libya. He said it was the worst mistake of his presidency. But I mean, in a court of law, you don't get to say I raped someone, but it was a mistake, and then they just let you off the hook. But he destroyed an entire country. He ruined millions of lives. So it really speaks to a certain double standard here. And the double standard relates to what Russell Brand was saying, his political speech about Ukraine, about COVID, about the corporate media. People, he's being targeted for that now we know it's by the British government. Aaron, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Well, so the British government, just help me understand this. So the British government sent a letter to Rumble, basically asking them to kick Russell Brand off, or asking them to prevent him from monetizing his content. Is that what the letter said?
Yes.
Yeah. And then
here's the letter to TikTok, which is similar to the letter to Rumble. And it's from the Culture, Media, and Sports Committee, which is a significant arm of the British government we'll get into. And it was signed by someone named Dame Caroline Dinenage, who's the chair of that committee, who's a significant figure. And the letter says, we are concerned that Russell Brand may be able to profit from his content on the platform. We would be grateful if you could confirm whether Mr. Brand is able to monetize his TikTok post. Basically a request from the British government to demonetize him. And YouTube has definitely complied, but they've kept his videos so that they can still profit from the ad revenue and not him, because he brings in so much money.
Okay. And now there's also a new story up at the Grayzone by Kit Clarenberg.
Yeah.
Is that tied to this letter?
Yes. Yes. Sorry, I just got a message. Yeah.
Well, while you get it, let me.
I got it right here. So,
okay.
So basically, here's the answer to your question. Dame Caroline Dinenage submitted that letter to YouTube, to TikTok, to Rumble, and she is in her former position was involved in London's crackdown on dissent during the COVID-19 pandemic, because she oversees, as the head of this committee, the counter disinformation unit, which is embedded within Britain's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Basically, it's equivalent of the State Department, but it has an intelligence role. And they were flagging all sorts of content around COVID, and then telling private companies, YouTube, TikTok, etc., to remove that content. Now, according to a NGO called Big Brother Watch, which does essential work on censorship in the UK, 60% of those requests, which were flagged and removed, including accounts that were removed, were following Twitter's rules. So 60% of Twitter flaggings by the counter disinformation unit were not breaking any law or breaking any rules. And this is all about cracking down on dissent. So Dinenage was central to this. And she happens to be married to someone who is the deputy commander of Britain's 77th Division. That is an army division that is in charge of psychological operations, including setting up troll farms to blast out the British government's message behind the cover of Twitter users. This is someone who's deeply involved in deeply linked to the intelligence services, who's acting on their behalf and targeting Russell Brand because, well, not necessarily that he exploiting these allegations in order to silence the most prominent voice opposing the Ukraine proxy war and criticizing corporate media. And finally, Aaron, Dinenage is the main author of the online safety bill, which Russell Brand mentioned, and proposes currently one of the greatest threats to free speech in the supposedly democratic West. That's how she became a dame. She was honored by Princess Royal of the British royal family as a dame commander of the British Empire for her role in pushing through the online safety bill.
And I know the safety bill has been criticized by people who think it will harm free speech. What's the main issue that they have with this bill?
Well, the main issue is that the bill will mete out financial penalties to social media companies and encrypted apps like Signal, which are operating in the UK, and worse, if they fail to act as private law enforcement and remove users and hand over their data to the British state and British law enforcement agencies in order to create the safest internet in the world. Now, on the surface, the bill is marketed as a means of ensuring safety for minors, removing sites that publish disgusting pornography, revenge porn, deep fake porn, or encourage suicide. And these sites really are out there, and they really do serious harm to youth. And there's a certain site that encourages young people to commit suicide. I really question how it's able to continue to operate. It's shady. But as we've seen with the Counter Disinformation Unit, they're not just targeting actually harmful internet content. They're targeting political dissent, as we see with the Russell Brand affair, where they're targeting these people who pushed this bill through on the basis of protecting children, are targeting dissidents, and they're using anything they can to do it. So that's where the danger of this bill comes in. It will also open the door for the requirement of IDs in order to participate in internet activity, first to prove that you are of age in order to access certain sites. And then identification may take the form of facial biometric scans, and anonymity is then removed. It also governs encryption. Encrypted apps are being asked to, there's a provision, I think it's provision 122 of this bill that is the most controversial, in which encrypted apps are being forced to download government technology and allow the government a backdoor into users, supposedly to see if they're sharing harmful content. Here's the head of Signal actually warning about what this bill means for encrypted applications and the precedent that it sets globally. After I actually share it. And, this debate has been roaring in the UK for years.
I would imagine with a company like Signal, is when the regulator Ofcom is creating the codes of practice, they might say to Signal, well, what sort of data do you gather? And if Signal says, well, we don't gather data about people's messages, we can't possibly look at this. The regulator won't say you need to break encryption. It'll say that's fine, but you do have policies, let's say, on legal and appropriate use. How do you enforce those? What do you do?
None of that is specified in the bill, and this is our concern, because we hear things that are sensible like that from people like you, and then we look at the bill, and what is specified is a regime that would give Ofcom the power to demand that everyone in the UK download spyware that checks their messages before they're sent against a database of what is permissible to say and send and what is not permissible. And that is a precedent that authoritarian regimes are looking to the UK to set, to point to a liberal democracy that was the first to expand surveillance in the UN Human Rights Commissioner. This is unprecedented paradigm surveillance and paradigm shifting, not in the good way.
Yeah, so there you have it. I mean, I don't think it could have been said more clearly with the in relation to encrypted apps is the possibility that everyone will have to, I mean, there won't be encryption. And I don't believe that this bill is about safety. That term safety is one of the most dangerous terms in Western culture at this point. It's certainly one of the most insidious. It's about censorship. It's about controlling what we can see and hear at a time when the transatlantic establishment is terrified by the rise of populism. And this bill will set the standard for further legislation, as we're seeing across the EU with the Digital Services Act, which is very similar and is already requiring Twitter to self-censor in order to continue operating in EU territory. What it's also going to do is force all of these companies to hire compliance officers, like people from former FBI spooks, former GCHQ spooks, to get them in compliance with the government intelligence agencies and government agencies that are flagging content constantly. And so it's a huge boon for the intelligence contractor industry. So that's the problem with it. And it's been passed. And Aaron, we saw Kit Clarenberg, our colleague, get detained in the UK by counterterror police, interrogated for 8 hours about his work with the Grayzone, and specifically about his work on Paul Mason, exposing a top British journalist as a security state collaborator. And who was Paul Mason's handler? It was Andy Price, who also works with the Counter Disinformation Unit, the CDU. Remember, we did a live stream on that, and YouTube threatened us with a strike and took our live stream down.
Hopefully they don't do the same to this one, since we mentioned it.
Yeah, well, it will be revealing, and I think part of our job is, to be kind of a canary in the coal mine, or to expose the farce of liberal democracy just through the work we do. Here's the end of, this is the second to last paragraph in Kit Clarenberg's article about the British government and intelligence apparatus's role in the censorship of Russell Brand. As the Grayzone revealed in June 2023, Paul Mason, British journalist, had attempted to submit a formal complaint about the Grayzone to DCMS. That's the parliamentary committee that Dinenage is the head of, believing it would trigger a government investigation into this outlet's, quote, funding and activities, and ultimately its deplatforming. Mason's handler, a British intelligence agent named Andy Price, boasted in leaked emails of his personal role in YouTube's banning of, quote, Russian stuff in Britain. The CDU, the Counter Disinformation Unit, which operates under the banner of that parliamentary committee, has been confirmed as the government body responsible for these censorship demands. So I think there you have it, and it all kind of comes full circle. And that's why I think this online safety bill affects all alternative media. And we do have a large following in the UK.
Yeah. So on the Russell Brand allegations, they're obviously, as you said, extremely serious. They deserve to be investigated. All these accusers deserve to be heard. And, in my opinion, not dismissed as being part of a conspiracy, as some people have said about them. They have the right, it's obvious Russell Brand, as you mentioned, was in a much different time of his life, I know he had substance abuse issues. He had all kinds of issues. So all these allegations could very well be true, all of them. And they're not all the same. There's one woman who alleged rape, I believe, and then others, their experiences vary in terms of the severity of the allegation. But the bottom line,
from my personal point of view, they are clearly part of a conspiracy, but that doesn't mean that the allegations are necessarily untrue.
Right. Okay. Got it. Yeah. So, but the part where this is now being seized, as Kit Clarenberg reported on at the Grayzone by this member of parliament to call for demonetizing Russell Brand. I mean, that's the part that is definitely part of a suppression effort. That's just undeniable. And overall, you have now this media narrative I've seen from a few people that basically this somehow taints anti-establishment media, that somehow if you promote anti-establishment thinking, then somehow you're an apologist for sexual assault, which is just totally insane. And one example of this comes from The Guardian. This is a very illustrative headline. It's from Jim Watterson, the media editor. Now we'll see how many bought Brand's anti-mainstream media shtick. The comedian has already left the mainstream and exists in a parallel world of podcasts and YouTube ads. So the implication there is pretty clear that if you're outside of the establishment in this parallel world, outside of the enlightened halls of power, such as at The Guardian, then somehow you're in this parallel universe where everything is upside down and everybody's now a rape apologist. And I've seen people push this line that basically Russell Brand's been grooming his audience to like disbelieve the allegations against him just because he's gone against the establishment on other issues. So this was part of some sophisticated plot by Russell Brand to like prepare his audience to defend him finally when he was accused for sexual assault. And that's why, by implication, he was opposing the Ukraine proxy war or raising questions about everything we were told about COVID-19 and the vaccine. I mean, people using this now to try to prop up the establishment, it's very, very predictable. And yeah, that totally is grounds to then question the narrative we're seeing about Russell Brand. And the bottom line is, like everybody else, Russell Brand deserves due process. And he doesn't deserve to be tried by a media mob. And just as the accusers have the right to be heard and be respected, so does Russell Brand. He has the right to face what everybody should get when it comes to a serious allegation, which is due process. And the double standard of canceling him immediately while still war criminals walk the earth and are celebrated. And, Hillary Clinton has shows on Apple about gutsy women, and we're supposed to all just pretend as if that's normal. So yeah, I'm certainly not gonna buy it, not gonna cater to that whatsoever.
Yeah, it articles like that, the way they're framed, are designed to terrify the public into accepting the officially guided narrative. Because if you question, you're a rape apologist. Just as if you questioned official directives during the COVID event, you were endangering public health. You were getting people killed. Yeah. Or you are a Russia apologist or a Putin puppet for questioning Russiagate or the Ukraine proxy war. And we have to question everything, especially when the British government is not even hiding its fingerprints here. It's not hiding it. And they have attempted to come for us purely on the basis of our speech. There's no off-platform behavior, bad behavior they're even exploiting. I mean, we know what their game is. We know what their technology is. So how are we going to not? How are we not going to see that something is fishy here? And why didn't this come out before, when everybody knew about Russell Brand's antics, which he has subsequently written about? It's so obvious. It's so obvious. I don't know if it will go any further. Will he be prosecuted? I don't know. But so far, there has been no real due process. I don't know what due process can mean in any case, unless it's going to go to court.
Yeah, one thing, I saw a brief clip of one of the documentaries, and one of the women was speaking, and they were using this like really dramatic music and film techniques, film techniques. And I think Glenn Greenwald pointed this out, or I heard this said somewhere, that basically, I mean, these are serious allegations. You don't need to sort of dress them up with dramatic film techniques of dramatic music and filming techniques. I mean, if you have an allegation, you should make it and it should be heard. But the way this was presented, there was just something, it was a very sophisticated presentation. And I think the allegations should stand on their own and not without sort of elaborate filming and production techniques to enforce them. I mean, there's something to me that's just distasteful about that, and just not the way to bring these allegations forward. If you have an allegation, you should make it. But again, the fact that it's done in this elaborate way, that will naturally raise questions about, what the agenda is here, what the interest is. And as you said, the allegations could very well be true, but that doesn't mean we can't question the way they're being used and the way Russell Brand is being convicted without any form of due process at all.
And I mean, another tell was that it dropped in the Times of London, which has gone after relentlessly the OPCW whistleblowers, the inspectors, again and again, when the public has very little interest in that. It was just an arcane subject that kept getting hammered because it was important to the British intelligence apparatus, and the Times of London is one of their favorite repositories, one of their favorite megaphones. It was a reporter named Charlotte Wace, I believe, who took the lead on the Russell Brand story, and she previously destroyed the life of a beautician, falsely accusing her of rogue Botox treatments that were messing up people's faces. She destroyed her family. The Times of London was sued for libel when the story was proven completely false, and they went to court anyway and fought this poor woman tooth and nail in court after wrecking her life. It's that kind of reporting, whether it's destroying dissidents and going after, or going after the professors, Pierce Robinson and David Miller in the Times for bringing out the Duma deception, or questioning the COVID event, or destroying a beautician that leads millions and millions of people to automatically disbelieve allegations, whether they're true or not. It's why I said on the Hill, when they asked me about this on Rising, I said, if Russell Brand had actually thrown women up on tenterhooks, like a Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in a rural, off some rural rest stop in Texas, millions of people still wouldn't believe it if the story came out in the Times of London, because of their record of lying about so many other people and proving themselves to be an enemy of the people, and always punching down and always attacking dissidents and never holding accountable people like Tony Blair, who just hired the Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin to reward her for bringing Finland into NATO. I mean, that's the problem here that the media faces, is nobody believes them anymore. That's why Russell Brand is popular. And that's why another reason why Donald Trump gets more and more popular with each indictment. They have no way of solving that problem, squaring the circle, or answering the contradiction, except to just hard censor and jail people. They don't have any other way at this point.
Yeah, and I'm not going to take seriously people, media personalities, journalists, who want to immediately cancel Russell Brand, but don't have the courage to cover the issues that he does. So, for example, you mentioned Duma and the OPCW whistleblower story. He covered that story. I've been on a show to talk about that. And you have all these people who are too craven and opportunistic to cover stories like that. And so, of course, when someone like Russell Brand faces this kind of controversy, of course they're going to want to rush to immediately cancel him, immediately get him off the air, because they don't want people around who will cover issues that they're too cowardly to address, because they're busy covering up for the establishment. And that's also something worth just keeping in mind here. There is a proper way to respond to allegations of sexual assault. And that starts with giving everyone equal treatment and giving someone due process. And the moment you stop seeing that is when you have a media mob. And I'm not going to take part in that.
Yeah, that's just a very noble statement, and I feel like I've learned my lesson. I've talked about it in other forums, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but I've seen mobs take down people in the progressive and alternative media world, and looking back, it was just completely unjustified and did nothing but destroy and left nothing in its wake. Nothing productive was created. But there are also other people who need to be held accountable for their behavior. So I don't know. We're going to keep following it, but we're following the bigger picture, which is that these liberal democratic governments will stop at nothing to prevent us from hearing and seeing, ingesting information and facts and history that interrupts and contravenes their objective, which is to control the world. And I know I sound like Alex Jones saying that or something, sound a little dramatic, but it's really just the conclusion that I've been forced to come to. And they're growing increasingly ruthless. I'm glad I'm not living in the UK. They're much less free than we are in the US. I'm also glad I'm not in Canada. I'm in Washington, D.C. And, actually in Washington, D.C., the city's lost almost 100,000 people in the past year, like 50,000 to 100,000 people, because no one can afford to live anywhere here. So it's like a very unappealing model is emerging, where people can't afford to live in places where there once was a sense of community, and they're not allowed to speak in what passes for our digital commons because they're completely privatized and controlled from the outside and co-opted by government forces. And I don't know if we want to wrap it up there. I mean, I wanted to talk about the diplomatic row between Canada and India. I hate saying that.
That's a great media word. People love to use that term.
There's another row.
I have to sign off. So if you wanted to talk about it, you could close out the show solo. But I have to log off.
I'm gonna log off too and just go back to life.
All right. Well, next time we'll do it next week.
Yeah, we'll do it next week or whatever. Just follow me on Twitter, or maybe I'll do another stream. And also look out for a possible color revolution in Republic of Georgia, not the state of Georgia. There's rumblings there of another kind of Maidan style coup. What we just saw happen in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh was a terrifying preview. Maybe we'll cover that next time as well, or maybe it'll happen. But there's so many developments I wish we could cover, but I got to get back to work. I have an edit to finish up. We're covering this upcoming trial of the former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's on trial in New York for a massive drug trafficking conspiracy. And what the indictment shows is that the U.S. and specifically the DEA was aware of all of the drug trafficking and the institutionalization of drug trafficking in Honduras the whole time. And this was their guy who they brought in through a coup, through false election, through bogus elections, fixed elections that the State Department was green lighting. So I think it's a hugely significant case, and we're one of the few English language outfits covering it. So we're going to be publishing part 2 of Alex Rubinstein's investigation too. So check out the site for that. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say or anything you're working on, Aaron, other than your book.
Yeah, I'm in book mode, but please like the stream. If this stream ends up getting censored, then your like will be for naught. But until then, it will help us out to beat the algorithmic suppression and let other people know that it exists. And is the Grayzone fundraiser still going?
Well, yeah, we could always use more. We haven't quite reached our goal, but it's been an amazing success thanks to all of you 300,000 lovelies and spiritually enlightened people, to paraphrase Russell Brand. But yeah, it's been a big success, and we're going to be able to support Kit, Alex, and Wyatt for the next 2 years, thanks to all of you. And,
so go to spotfund.com, and search Grayzone, and you'll see the fundraiser. The fundraiser 2.0 after GoFundMe blocked the first one under pressure from, we still don't know who, right? It was just external concerns.
They said due to external concerns. I mean, that's the funny thing is I was on Russell Brand's show like just a few days before the allegations dropped to talk about that.
Yeah.
And it was so similar to what was done to him with YouTube. I assume it was probably the same forces.
Who knows? But you can certainly help support the Grayzone if you go to that fundraiser, spotfund.com, search for the Grayzone. And yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in.
All right, you awakening wonders. Peace.
Peace.